I live in Australia, and I'm worried about recent change in global politics. Trump is trying to improve and normalize relations with dictator Putin, and it seems like he also wants to work with China, and he thinks that US is some kind of a company and he's the CEO of it, and that his company is in a state of loss right now. You know that China regularly violates Australian waters. What steps should Australia take in this rapid changing of the world order? Right. So yeah, Putin is a dictator. Fine. Let's do away with the niceties and all that. Sure, he's a dictator. So is Mr. Xi. Mr. Xi is also a dictator, right? He's kind of the emperor of China, and Mr. Putin is kind of the Tsar of Russia. Yeah. Um, and Trump thinks that the US is some kind of a company and he is the CEO of it. Well, that's typically how a proactive president has historically been. Um, and if you want to really take away all the niceties, then Australia is like a US owned corporation. Okay, you have permanent US military bases in Australia. You always have US troops on Australian soil, and Australia is essentially a US protectorate. Um, until the 1940s, uh, the UK was in charge of Australia's protection essentially. And then the UK became a second rate world power because of the events of the 1940s, the World War, and so on. And then the US assumed the role of the protector and guardian of Australia. Now, if you look at the history, the US, Canada, it's the five Anglosphere nations, right? So culturally, linguistically, ethnically, very similar nations. Um, so if you look at the world from a very realistic, hard-nosed perspective, there is one major empire in the world, which is the US empire. Um, it's nothing but a continuation of the British Empire in 1944-45. The capital of the empire moved from London, UK, to Washington, D.C. That's all that happened. And it's the same entity that continues to rule the world. And Australia is a component of that. Australia is like a US owned corporation. And the US is in charge of Australia's security. And in the 40s, there was the worry in Australia that the Japanese would invade. And the US had to step in and ensure this doesn't happen. And eventually, we know the history. And today, there is a concern about China in Australia. So, and there's also concerns in Australia that Australia is deeply infiltrated by the Chinese, in various ways. So, yeah, all these issues are there. So, first of all, let's look at the world from a very realistic, pragmatic, hard nosed perspective. Putin is a dictator. She is a dictator. The US is an empire. Trump is the current emperor, CEO of the US, which seems to consider to be a company, sure. And to take it further, Australia is a US possession, a US owned corporation. The Prime Minister of Australia is not really a person who's genuinely in power. He does whatever the US wants him to do. He will never take any action that will be detrimental to US interests. And if he does, then he won't stay in power too long. So that's the situation in the world. But you know what? It doesn't matter because the people are reasonably prosperous. You have reasonable amounts of freedom, unless there's a lockdown or whatever, but that's how it goes. The Western world is one giant police state, which is the truth. Ask any politician from the EU, for example, off the record, they'll admit the Western world is a police state. But that's how it is. So now the question is, what does Australia do in this rapidly changing world order? What steps should Australia take to safeguard its interests, its national interests? What should Australia do? So first of all, Australia needs U.S. protection, and you need to safeguard your very large coastline and your territorial waters. The Chinese Navy is a big threat now, right? We know that they have the largest navy in terms of numbers in the world. Maybe not the most powerful navy, but definitely the largest navy, the most number of warships in the world. And I'm not sure how many missiles they can deploy, but I'm sure it's a sizable number of missiles. So that's uh, a big area of concern for Australia. The Chinese have multiple aircraft carriers now. So the US, so Australia needs US protection. You need American military bases on your territory. You need uh, interoperability with the US military, which you have. Yes. Maybe another thing you can do is have US nuclear weapons on your soil. I mean, in the 20th century, you did allow the Americans to test at least one nuclear weapon on Australian soil, didn't you? Uh, so you need that, and yeah. So essentially, you need US help to ward off the China threat, and the Chinese obviously are currently facing lots of issues with the US. Trump started the trade war in 20 during his first presidency, and there was a historical reversal of US policy towards China. And now the two nations are, well, adversaries in a variety of, in all domains, essentially, in technology, in the military domain, in the naval domain, in space, in diplomacy, in everything, in economics, in trade, everything. They're adversaries. So you need the US on your side. The Chinese, nobody talks about China's rise anymore. China's peaceful rise, which was not very peaceful. It was kind of scary, very threatening. But now they've toned it down. But the threat remains from your perspective. So you need the US on your side. Democracy and all, it's okay. And you need to bolster your military as well. So you need your own submarines. You have this AUKUS deal. You're gonna have a bunch of nuclear submarines, which will technically be yours, but it will be those will be operated by Americans from Australian ports. Well, whatever, it's okay as long as it keeps you safe. So that's what you need to do. Essentially, to make a long story short, you need to put all your eggs in the US basket, and you're part of the Quad as well, which means you're gonna have interoperability with the New Zealand, not New Zealand, with the Americans, the Japanese, and to some extent us, the Indians. And obviously, the Quad is focused around China, the Chinese threat. So yeah, you need to participate in all of this and be friends with all like-minded nations, all nations that are scared of China, including us. China is scary, believe it, believe me. So that's what you need to do.